want to invite my dear friend, Steve Case, to join me for this panel. Thank you all for being here with us today.
Well, I'm glad you didn't do that Spanish online thing.
Why?
Well, because we later launched AOL Spain, and you might have been a threat. So
well, it would have been a nice.
I think it seemed like you had a pretty good career arc as well. So
well, I had to settle with.
Although I also say, I mentioned this to some folks last night. I'm very happy for Atlanta and Georgia Tech that Angel is here. But he was at George Mason. I'm in the D.C. area and was one of the great leaders in the D.C. region. So we were a little sad to lose him. So I hope you appreciate what you got here as an inspiring leader that can kind of take not only Georgia Tech forward, but take the Atlanta region forward. So when he called a month or so ago and said, we're going to do this event, we haven't done any events in a while. This is actually my first business trip in like a year. So it's like, oh, I guess we're all climbing out from under the rock. It was, and he wanted to talk particularly around entrepreneurship and specifically around inclusive entrepreneurship. I had to make the trip. It's great to be here and great to see the progress over the years.
Wow, thank you, Steve. I think we should leave the conversation there.
Thank you all for coming. This part of the session is now done.
Well, you have learned so much in the last, I don't know when you started Rise of the Rest, but it's been definitely more than 6 years. I don't know when exactly you started, but as you travel the country and you've seen what works, what doesn't work, you've encountered entrepreneurs, what are the main patterns that are beginning to emerge in your mind when you sort of see, okay, you go to a city, see things are happening here. I feel I would invest in this place. I think or versus another one, which is, oh my gosh, they're going totally in the wrong direction. Without naming names, but I mean, what are those patterns that in your mind are emerging?
A bunch of things, but first of all, I should introduce David Hall. If you could stand up for a minute and wave. David is the managing partner of our Rise of the Rest fund, but more importantly to all of you, he's a Morehouse grad, so knows the Atlanta area pretty well, and he's been with us at Revolution for well over a decade and led a lot of the efforts to try to kind of propel these other rising cities and identify great entrepreneurs in different cities. And through the Rise of the Rest fund, we've now invested in 160 companies in 80 cities in 35 states. And we've done actually these bus trips we've done, including being in Atlanta about 6 years ago, including being hosted by Bud and seeing a lot of things happening there. We've now done those bus tours to 43 cities. And so we've seen a lot of the country, and we've seen an interesting and encouraging sign of more and more places, kind of rising, bubbling up as entrepreneurship hubs. Obviously, Atlanta has seen a lot of momentum in the recent years and does seem poised for a real acceleration in the next decade or so. But if you just look at the data, according to the National Venture Capital Association, despite that progress, last year 75% of venture capital went to 3 states: California, New York, Massachusetts. 75%. Georgia, 1%. Ohio, 1%. Pennsylvania, 1%. Virginia, 1%. Michigan, 1%. Texas, everything I guess is bigger in Texas. It's a little bit bigger, 2%. It's still a disconnect in terms of where the ideas are and the entrepreneurs are and the creativity is, which is clearly more kind of widely dispersed, and where the opportunity is to really build a company. As a result, we've seen over the past half century a real brain drain in most of the country, where people graduating from some of the great schools who wanted to do something entrepreneurial felt like they had to go somewhere else, and usually they went to the coast, usually to the Silicon Valley. So that became this magnet for talent. And there are great things about Silicon Valley, and some people may actually prefer being there. But a lot of it was because there really wasn't much happening 20 years ago in Atlanta or in Pittsburgh or in some of these other cities. So we're encouraged by what we've seen, but there's still kind of a lot of work to do. And we've published a lot of these, which are freely available on the web, Rise of the Rest playbooks in terms of what we've learned in different cities. So I'd encourage you to look at those. But if I try to really simplify it, it comes down to 3 things. And actually, this should give you some comfort that Atlanta, which has, as you know, a lot of you have been working on this for decades, has been on the rise, is poised for this acceleration. One is this talent issue. You have to win the battle for talent. And that means being a magnet for getting people to come here, but it also means keeping what you already got. People are growing up here, or people are coming to Georgia Tech or other places. How do you keep them here as opposed to having this brain drain? Indeed, which is we're starting to see in a number of cities, and I guess you're an example. How do you get a boomerang of people who left that place and for some reason now feel it's time to go back? So the talent piece is hugely important. We actually are launching next month a tech talent tour across the country, tied in with Rise the Rest, with a lot of different speakers, trying to essentially deal with this talent issue, because companies will tell you that and investors will tell you that it's what they worry about now is not getting the company started. Because that can be done with a small team and a little bit of capital. They worry about scaling the company. Like if it's successful, can that community support 1,000, 5,000 employees? And so how do you focus on the scaling and get people, including some who did leave, maybe had great experiences, Silicon Valley or some other place, who were part of scaling companies? How do you get some of those folks back? So talent would be number one. Capital obviously is number two. How do you get more capital off the sidelines locally with angel networks? How do you support the development of more regional venture funds? And how do you kind of get people on the coast paying attention to what's happening in places like Atlanta? Because people talk about, if you have an idea, the way you get started is you have like this friends and family round, and you raise a little bit of money to kind of get started. Well, that's great if you have friends and family have money, but not everybody has friends and family that have money, which ties in with your inclusive entrepreneurship theme. So you need to figure out ways to get that seed capital going to at least give people a shot of getting on the playing field. And you need to figure out how, as these companies scale, you access the larger pools of capital at the venture and growth stage to really be able to scale that company and seize the opportunity. So the capital piece is super important. And the third piece, this is one we talked about last night, that I think is encouraging in terms of what we're seeing in Atlanta, is collaboration in the community. That many places we visited are way too siloed. People are actually doing interesting things here or there, but they're not doing it in a networked way. They're not doing it in a collaborative way. And usually the universities are too disconnected from the startup community. Almost all places, the big companies are disconnected from the startup communities. And in most communities, although it's getting better, the mayors and governors are focused on economic development in a traditional way, luring a big company, as opposed to what I think is the right way, which is nurturing new companies. And so that collaboration network, and also a sense of wonder and possibility. Because, and you said this in your introduction, starting a company is scary and it's risky. Most fail. If you're in a community that basically says, if you start a company and it fails, you're a failure, that makes it a lot harder for people who want to take the risk. If you're in a community that says, well, good for you. That actually was a good idea. It didn't work out that well, but good for you for taking that shot. And I bet next time you'll be even better and you'll be more successful because you'll learn from that. And focus, even when you hear a startup pitch, as a community, not on what might go wrong, the risk factors, which of course you should be looking at, but not obsess about. But what might go right? If this works, what might be possible? And that is what's one of the great things. I have my criticisms about Silicon Valley, but one of the great things is that sense of what might go right, is that sense of networking and collaboration and wonder and possibility. So to me, those are the key ones. You gotta win the battle for talent. Atlanta is doing well on that front, and the work of Bud was doing, and Wayne before him, and now Angel and many others in the community. Again, I know, and some of you have been working on this for a long time. You're doing a better job of keeping people, and you're also starting to boomerang people, and you're getting big companies to set up offices here, Microsoft and so forth. That's all encouraging. That should be helpful on the talent front. you're doing a better job, certainly than when we were here 6 years ago, in terms of capital, both locally, regionally, and nationally, paying attention to what's happening in Atlanta. Still more work to do, because as I said, I gave you the data in terms of venture capital in Georgia, not that good. So I wouldn't spike the football quite yet, but it's better than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And you're doing, I think, quite a good job on this collaboration community point, which is one of the areas as we travel around that I'm most concerned about, because most places are not doing well. So you should celebrate that. The fact that so many big companies are working together on, is Engage is the initiative, or Elevate or something. I remember something like that. That's that kind of thing. I think is super helpful. What the university is doing, including all the things you talked about, connecting the campus to the entrepreneurs and so forth, I think is important. So it bodes well. And the final point, I know it's a long answer to a short question, but I saw this 6 years ago. We talked about this 6 years ago, and it's great to see the theme of this around inclusive entrepreneurship. Atlanta will continue to rise. There are clearly some sectors, better than I, where Atlanta, is well positioned to lead. But the biggest opportunity for Atlanta is to emerge, and it's not going to be easy, because other cities are focused on this as well, as the most inclusive startup city. It's not just about this particular sector or that particular sector. It's creating that environment where everybody has a shot. It's much more united and collaborative and inclusive. And because of the diversity of Atlanta itself, you've got that kind of a great edge kind of going into it. It's not the case in many cities we've visited. But you need to be intentional about it, like this conference, and you need to go out of your way to be inclusive. I do remember, just again, this was 6 years ago, a lot's changed. But when we were touring around Atlanta in our bus for Rise the Rest, there were some places we were going that were, pretty nice, like Buckhead, where there's a lot of tech hub there, which was pretty interesting. Some interesting companies. And then we went kind of cross town to a place, I don't remember exactly where it was. It was more of an opportunity hub, and more of a kind of focused on Black founders. Most of the people, we invited people on our bus, which we always do, to kind of join us and wander around. Most of the people in that Buckhead area didn't even know this place existed, and probably most of them never visited that place. So it was something interesting happening that was bubbling, but it's not really my problem. So making it your community's problem or opportunity to be more inclusive, I think that's a big deal, and then I think that will then help in terms of attracting the talent. That will then help in terms of attracting that that capital, and will build on the good work that's already happened around connecting and celebrating and collaborating. So that to me which is why the main reason I agreed, other than I like you and you asked me and I'm happy to do it, wanted to come down here, was to say this is a moment. We can talk about sort of why it's, particularly with the pandemic, in terms of how people are thinking about work and life and moving, and dispersion of talent and capital and so forth is likely going to accelerate. It's a moment. It's great that Atlanta recognizes that and is seizing that. And I would just urge you to do that in this inclusive way, because that is, to me, the number one opportunity for Atlanta.
Let's talk about the pandemic, perhaps, because I think there was a way of thinking during the pandemic. Oh my gosh, we've discovered remote work. All of us learned to use those tools. I think 9 months into it, now we even know how to unmute ourselves on time, to make our point. But we have developed this practice of working remotely. At some point in time, there were these arguments about, hey, we're all going to be moving to some farm in Vermont and work. And so all of a sudden, cities don't matter, or place doesn't matter. And yet, the first opportunity we had to come together. Look at this room, people showed up, right? By the way, we could be watching it on YouTube like many people are, and yet people showed up. Is it the end of the city, or does place still matter? Does place matter for entrepreneurship?
Well, first of all, Vermont's pretty nice, so I would not be trashing Vermont. No, I think place matters, and I think cities matter, and I think clustering matters, and I think neighborhoods, innovation districts, like you built in Midtown and so forth, matter. I think there is something to that, particularly in the early stages where you're figuring things out. And entrepreneurship at its core, other than some of the things you mentioned about just the willingness to take the risk, is yes, bumping into an idea or bumping into people who have an idea. And saying, that's kind of interesting, or bumping into a problem that you see that you think might be a problem for other people and saying, maybe I should do something about it, or bumping into an opportunity saying, wow, that just had this idea that there could be a different, kind of like the internet 40 years ago for me. It could be a different kind of way to think about things and do things. You're not likely to do that on your own. You're likely to do that in some kind of group setting, and you're more likely to bump into a great idea if you bump into more people, and you're more likely to bump into more people if you're together with people and having kind of sometimes more casual, random conversations as opposed to being on a Zoom. So I would say the positive of again, there are obviously terrible tragedies of the pandemic, but a silver lining, if you're looking for one, is I think it will accelerate the rise of the rest. It will accelerate these rising cities. It will accelerate the boomerang of talent. It will accelerate capital flowing not just from the coast but to other parts of the country. So I actually think in the long run that's going to be a positive in terms of what's happening here. And we have learned, and most of us were surprised by this, is actually people are pretty productive remotely. And most of the surveys, even within our own company, Revolution, 95% of people said they're as productive or more productive, and 97% thought their teams were as productive, if not more productive. Nobody would have thought that possible 2 years ago. So clearly, there'll be some version of hybrid work. The idea everybody's going back to the office is not going to happen. People don't want it, and people are realizing maybe actually there are different things you do in your job, and everybody's job is different, but some actually are done more kind of solo and probably could be done from home or some other remote location, and others are done in more collaborative group settings, and so sometimes it makes sense to be in the office, and sometimes it makes sense to not. And I'm sure there's a lot of examples of that in the university kind of setting. So, we're entering a new world, which I think will be a complicated world. And next couple of years, actually, we're coming out of a difficult year because of the pandemic. We're entering what might be a more difficult year in terms of work, trying to figure out how this hybrid thing actually plays out. But I do think there's going to be continued benefits of that, as you say, the cities and the clustering. But it will be different, and people, some from large companies or even from startup companies, have opted to do an all-remote strategy. And there's some companies quite successful, over 1,000 people, all remote, even pre-pandemic. So clearly it's possible, but I don't think there'll be that many companies that are pure remote. I don't think there'll be that many companies that are back to the office 5 days a week, 9 to 5, got to be in the office every day. I think most will be somewhere in the middle, and figuring that out will be tricky. But it does go back to this theme of Atlanta as a rising startup city does create opportunity. That it's sort of a little bit like we have this shake the snow globe moment. Nobody knows exactly how it settles out, but there are definitely a lot of people, including probably some of you, are thinking like, what have I learned from this situation? Maybe I do want to live somewhere else. And maybe before that wasn't possible. Maybe now it is possible. Or if you're in a city, big city, maybe because if you have to commute every day, you kind of don't want to live too far away. If you come in once or twice a week, maybe you can. So the exurbs around superstar cities will likely kind of develop. So a bunch of things are going to happen. I am not smart enough to know exactly, nobody is exactly what's going to happen, but a bunch of things are going to happen, and recognizing it's in flux, it's in play. It's, as I said, sort of shake the snow globe. How does it settle out? Could be interesting. I think it would be smart for organizations and startups, including, but also cities, to say, okay, two ways to approach that. One is, assuming you buy into the basic thesis that this is a moment where there'll be some change. One is to sit back and watch, say, wow, this will be very interesting to watch. Let's see what happens. The other is to lean in and say, how can we influence what happens in a way that goes back to the key things, that we become a magnet for talent, some moving here, maybe some connecting remotely here. We become more of a magnet for capital. It is easier, venture capitalists now have figured out, if you're getting pitched on Zoom, what difference does it make if you're down the block in Palo Alto or you're across the country? You're still on the screen, and they, as a result, have been more willing to consider backing companies in other places and building more on that community point I just said. So just how do you, a lot of great work from a lot of people in this room over a lot of years. Totally understand that. You should feel good about the progress that's been made, but I would encourage you to say there's something bubbling out there, and this is a moment, so let's seize it.
Let's talk about fearlessness, a word that, of course, sounds familiar because it's your wife Jean's favorite word, which I have thought about a lot from her book and her many talks on. So I mentioned how I was one of those who'd never had the courage to actually go out and set up. So I was not sufficiently fearless. Now, in my defense, when I returned to Spain, there was not such culture. I could not look around and see people like me who were doing that, who were quitting their jobs, who were making that idea happen. And you've mentioned how in Silicon Valley there is such thing. Well, I suspect that in building this hub of not just entrepreneurship, but inclusive entrepreneurship, role models will matter a great deal. And that means that somehow, I guess it's more of a reflection, but also leading to a question about what is the best thing we can do. I mean, recently, for example, we had Paul Judge, also, a very proud member of the Morehouse community. Better, David? Yeah. And anyway, so we invited him to be our commencement speaker. And as he was sharing his journey of entrepreneurship, I was like, this is awesome. I didn't have that. And I was not sitting there the day I was graduating and have one of those crazy guys telling me, yes, you can do this. And this is how I did it, right? What is it we can do to elevate those role models that hopefully start creating that expectation in a city like this that, yes, you can be a Black woman, you can be a Hispanic man, you can be whatever you are, and you have a shot at this?
Well, I'd say I grew up in Hawaii, and my father was a lawyer, my mom was a teacher. The community actually is pretty cautious and risk averse, and there's some reason why historically they're more focused on protecting what they have and not really welcoming change, because change has been bad in some respects in terms of at least how a lot of people look at it. So it was not particularly encouraging of entrepreneurs. My parents, frankly, are pretty traditional. My dad worked for the same law firm for like 50 years. It's like, I went to, my first job was Procter & Gamble in Ohio. Actually lived in Atlanta for a few months working for P&G when I was doing sales training like 40 years ago. And then left that after like two and a half years to go to what was then a division of PepsiCo, Pizza Hut in Wichita, Kansas. Did that for all of 1 year, then moved to the Washington, D.C. area to join a startup. I wanted to be part of a startup and wanted to be part of this, what I thought this internet thing would develop. And it was an interesting company. And I joined that. And 6 months later, it was like in free fall, kind of about to go bankrupt. And so my parents were kind of freaking out. Like, it seemed like he was off to the P&G. They understood. They were kind of proud of me when I was at P&G. Pizza Hut seemed like a step down to them. It didn't seem like forward progress. Joining a startup was definitely a step down, and having the startup kind of hitting the wall was like, whoa, this is like a bummer. So I kind of lived through this. I kind of still believed in that idea. And eventually, a couple of people I met, and we started AOL, and it was hard to raise capital. Nobody believed in us. Nobody believed in the idea of the internet. And it was a real struggle. We almost went out under a couple times. We just kept at it and kept fighting, and eventually broke through. I should say, going back to the Atlanta situation, in that first wave of the internet, when we were building the on-ramps and trying to educate people why they should get online and getting all the content and so forth to make it interesting when they got online. And when we started in 1985, you referenced this in your opening remarks, it was still illegal for consumers or businesses to be online. It was restricted to educational institutions like a Georgia Tech or government institutions like whatever, the CIA or something. You could be on the internet, but consumers and businesses couldn't be on the internet. And it took a while to change that law. And one of the most important companies in that first era was Hayes, a modem company in Atlanta. They were really, if you wanted to get online back then, you had to buy this personal computer. But the personal computer could not communicate. You had to buy this thing called a modem and figure out how to make that work. And most of those modems came from Atlanta, from Hayes. At the time, that first wave of the internet was regionally distributed. I mentioned we were in the DC area. Hayes was here. Sprint, the communications company, was in Kansas City. CompuServe, an online service, was in Columbus, Ohio. A bunch of the IBM's PC operations were in Boca Raton, Florida. Gateway was North Dakota. Dell was in Austin. Microsoft actually started in Albuquerque and then moved to Seattle. It was kind of regionally distributed. It's only the last couple of decades in the second wave of the internet where it's kind of concentrated on Silicon Valley, which is why I think it can redistribute in this third wave. So yeah, my own experience as an entrepreneur and trying to pursue something that people around me didn't really believe in. I kind of lived that experience, but at least I had a sense of what entrepreneurship was. It's still a funny word. I mean, I don't think I knew actually what an entrepreneur was until after I was an entrepreneur. But I knew I liked starting things, and I knew I liked the business. But there are many people in many parts of the community, including for sure in Atlanta, that don't understand that, don't see that as a path, don't see kind of the role models, which is why. You mentioned my wife, Jean. She chairs National Geographic Society and on Hill's on the board of Nat Geo, and wrote this book called Be Fearless a couple of years ago. One of the things they did at the Case Foundation, probably now 6 or 7 years ago, understanding this problem, has launched an initiative called Faces of Founders, like a hashtag Faces of Founders, because they found it may have changed, but probably hasn't changed much. If you searched on Google for famous American entrepreneurs, it's all white guys. All white guys. Occasionally Oprah might sneak in there, but for it was most of the time it was all white guys. If you do it today, it probably not changed that much. So they said, well, there actually are great entrepreneurs who are Black, great entrepreneurs who are women, et cetera. But their stories are not elevated. They're kind of these hidden figures. And how do you, tell those stories, create those sort of role models, like a Sarah Blakely here in Atlanta, who started her company, and so how do you make sure that people see that it's understand it's a possibility? It's like maybe it's something I could do, and see examples of people who did it with with great success. So I think that's very important. It's a critical part of this whole idea of inclusive entrepreneurship.
About the talent question, which is the number one that you mentioned on your sort of your list of absolute must-haves. And you talk both about producing talent. We're very well served there. I mean, Georgia Tech is perhaps the country's largest science and tech focused university. Georgia State is a giant among sort of urban serving institutions. Kansas State not far away. We have the HBCUs right in town. We have a very interesting ecosystem. But you also mentioned you have to keep them here.
Right.
By the way, we have thousands of alums of Georgia Tech right now in Seattle and in the Silicon Valley and in New York City. So whatever happens in the city, lifestyle, the arts, when you travel the country, how does that factor in? And by the way, knowing also that you are in that world because you currently chair the board of the Smithsonian, which is, of course, the ultimate sort of arts and cultural institution in the country. How important is that? How important is the sort of the arts buzz, the sort of the life in a city to create that dynamic?
I think it's very important. It goes back to the clustering point. You've got to create a city that people want to live in. And that has many facets to it, obviously, but Some of it is making it safe. I remember when I was in Atlanta 40 years ago, a lot of parts, including not far from here, weren't particularly safe. That sort of, kind of makes people less likely to, want to plant their flag, raise their family there. And you've got to make it interesting and tying in with universities and others, so it's intellectually interesting. You've got to create places like the Beltline that make it kind of integrate a little bit the city, connect the city, and also create some kind of outdoor kind of lifestyle, hiking, biking, things like that. You've got to create an environment with a little brew pubs, coffee houses, restaurants, what have you, that make it kind of fun and interesting. All that stuff matters. It sort of becomes again, helps become the magnet. One of the things that's striking about these various cities, now that we visited so many of them, is all of them have this area of the city that is the city overall is on the rise, but there's a particular area that's on the rise. Remember in Cincinnati, it was an area called OTR, over the Rhine, and Chattanooga, it was an innovation district. They all have a place where people are focused and entrepreneurs are clustering, and usually artists are clustering too. There's something about that, so I think that makes it. And when people go to those cities, including people who've been there before, grew up there, went to school there, but haven't been there in a while, they're surprised there's stuff happening there. And people who've never been there, who visit, like, this is kind of awesome. I had no idea. And a great example is Tulsa, about 4 years ago, launched an initiative called Tulsa Remote. And they basically said, we'll pay people $10,000 to move to Tulsa because we want to get more, kind of people. And you can work, particularly jobs that were remote worker jobs. This is obviously pre-pandemic. I can't remember how many, I think they were going to pick a few dozen and got like thousands and thousands of applications, which shocked me. But what shocked me more is the majority, I guess it didn't shock me, I was encouraged by it, is the majority of the people who participated in that program had never been to Tulsa. Many of them didn't even know where Tulsa was, but they were intrigued. And then the people who came, I haven't seen the latest data, but the overwhelming majority stayed. A bunch of people bought houses because they said, like, Tulsa's like really cool. I had no idea. And so just getting people to understand that and see those different places. Over the Rhine in OTR in Cincinnati, when I was at P&G in Cincinnati, that was the worst neighborhood in town. And I think it was 15 years ago, there was like a top worst 10 neighborhoods in terms of murders in the country. OTR was in the top 10. It's not a top 10 you want to be in. Well, now it's actually the coolest neighborhood in Cincinnati. And it's been kind of revitalized, and entrepreneurs have moved in, and so forth. So it has all the dynamics I just mentioned. So before, when I was there, you didn't want to be there. Now that's the place you want to be. And there's obviously a lot of places in Atlanta have seen that kind of resurgence, and so I think that's important to create that connective tissue, that gathering. The other program that's now been modeled in other cities, and I don't know if Atlanta's doing it, but you look at it, Detroit launched something probably 5 or 6 years ago called Detroit Homecoming. And they said, like, Detroit has had a tough run, a couple, a whole host of things. Actually, 7 or 8 years ago, the city went bankrupt. And it is worth mentioning, just point of history, that 100 years ago, Detroit was Silicon Valley. It was the most innovative city in the country when the car was the hot technology of the day. And everybody wanted to be part of the automobile revolution, and people were flooding to Detroit. It went from being kind of the king of the hill in terms of innovation, entrepreneurship, kind of magnet for talent, magnet for capital, to, lost 60% of its population in 50 years and then went bankrupt. But they've been doing a lot of work, again, cross-sector, air, foundations like Kresge, entrepreneurs like Dan Gilbert, governor, others were like, including support from other companies, and even some White House support. They said, okay, well, let's rebuild Detroit, and particularly starting with the downtown Detroit area. And a bunch of interesting things have happened that most people, including people who used to live in Detroit, have no idea what was happening. So they said, let's put this program together. Let's pick a weekend, like a long weekend, anchor it with like an awesome sporting event and or an awesome concert that people say, well, that sounds like it's worth going to. And then build a whole set of experiences that would kind of reintroduce the city to people who had a connection, but had left it and had no plans to come back in most cases. I spoke at that a couple times, and it's interesting how some of the people who go there, all the people who go there, are pleasantly surprised by what's happening, which is more than they expected. And some have decided to move back. Some have decided to be a mentor to an entrepreneur. Some have decided to invest in some kind of startup. So it's a way to reconnect kind of the folks that have left by reminding them or kind of because reawakening them, I guess, in terms of what's happening that they might not have been aware of. And so there are all these different programs we're seeing in different cities that I think are ways to kind of get some of that talent back. But I assume you're tracking it. But I would watch the statistics in terms of at Georgia Tech 10 years ago, today, 10 years from now. Are you winning the battle to keep your graduates here? Are you starting to win the battle to lure some of them back? Because I think that will be a pretty good determiner. The capital will follow the talent, and so
I haven't looked at those numbers, but that's it. Yeah.
And people say follow the money. I'd say follow the talent.
Follow the talent. Follow the talent. No, that's absolutely a great idea. We're going to look into those days. So, would it be a good idea to somehow figure out what the Atlanta equivalent of the South by Southwest is? Mm-hmm. I mean, does that kind of dynamic work?
It worked super well for Austin. Obviously, it helped put them on the map. And some of it was a success of Dell and some other companies there, some semiconductors, other things. But South by definitely kind of made it. A lot of people had never gone to Austin other than for South by, and it's kind of cool. I kind of like this, and that created more of an environment, more of a magnet. So I don't think nobody should try to replicate Silicon Valley. It'd be hard to replicate South by. These things kind of have a certain kind of arc to them and authenticity to them that are kind of difficult to knock off. But looking for ways to create different events. I'm sure you have a lot of them, but most people don't even know about them. That are those kind of magnets that kind of get people. And then when you got them, figure out ways to, of course, you should entertain them with a football game or a concert or whatever you might want to do. Yeah, but figure out some way to get them out in the community, some way to get them to see some of the things and meet some of the people that they hadn't otherwise met. And I think universities are particularly good at universities are good at these reunions that get people back for reunion year and reconnect people, which is great. How do you have the equivalent of that focused on this battle for talent, particularly kind of entrepreneurial talent, tech talent, using this university as a platform to kind of, again, track the people you're losing and why, and then track the people who you're getting back, and figuring out ways to keep the ones you're losing and get more of the ones you're boomeranging back.
See, we have our homework already. That's a great idea. So I'm getting signs, and I hate to ask this because it's kind of a heavy question, but maybe you can give us the headline, or you can pass if you want to. But I know.
I think I'm going to pass it before I even get the question. I got to set up as that. I don't want to touch this.
You are passionate about it. I mean, you have been pretty vocal about immigration reform, and obviously, I pay attention to those things because I am an immigrant myself. And when I look around and my faculty colleagues, many of us are. Our EVP is an immigrant from Lebanon. Red Mayor, an entrepreneur faculty member, is an immigrant from South Africa. Yesterday, you met also Gleb Yushin from Russia. It said Ukraine yesterday by mistake. So we do have a lot of, many of my colleagues here that come from all over the world that somehow have converged here. So we pay attention when leaders like you, who you are not an immigrant, all of a sudden speak up and say, this is why we ought to. Why is this an area of policy that you care so much about? I told you it was a little heavy duty for.
No, it's not. It's super simple, because the story of America is a story of innovation, entrepreneurship, and many, not all, but many of the greatest companies and the greatest industries were started by immigrants. 40% of the Fortune 500 companies were started by immigrants or children of immigrants. 50% of the tech companies in Silicon Valley started by immigrants. Kind of seems important. If you want to win what's now talked about, the battle for talent within the country, there's also global battle for talent. And the countries that win the global battle for talent will win the future. And we went from this, I think it's worth also remembering that 250 years ago, America itself was a startup. It was just an idea, a pretty fragile idea that almost hit the wall like several times. And now it's like the leader of the free world. Well, why? I'm not a historian. There are probably smarter people in this room, but I have a little bit of the story. Because we have the leading economy in the world. Oh, so why? Well, because we went from that fragile startup idea to lead the way in the agricultural revolution, which is kind of a big deal, and then lead the way in the industrial revolution, which is kind of a big deal, and more recently lead the way in the digital revolution, which is kind of a big deal. So we went from nothing to the leader. Many other aspects to it, but that's the key part of it, kind of maybe the underpinning of it. We've been the most innovative, entrepreneurial, pioneering nation in the world, and that's why America is America. So how do you continue that leadership now that other countries have figured out that the secret sauce that's powered the American story is entrepreneurship and are trying to win the next battle for all the reasons we're talking about, China and many others? Well, it seems like you have to, within your country, be more inclusive. So if you're only backing a few kinds of entrepreneurs who look a certain kind of way in certain places, that seems like a lot of missed opportunity, because some of the people you're missing may very well have the big idea of the future, not just for a company, but for a new industry. So spreading, all the things we're talking about, spreading capital more broadly and opportunity more broadly is important. On that data point, by the way, I talked about the 75% of capital going to 3 states, which that's kind of a bummer. Gets worse, just for those who aren't tracking this. I don't want to ruin your morning, but it gets worse. Last year, over 90% of venture capital went to men, less than 10% to women, even though women are 50% of the population. Last year, even though 13% of the population are Black Americans, less than 1% went to Black founders. So it's pretty clear that it does matter where you live, and it doesn't matter what you look like, and it kind of matters who you know. Whether you have an idea, you have a shot at the American dream, a shot at building that company. So there's a lot that needs to be done just in your own community, in your own country, full stop. But you can't stop there. You've got to keep going, and you've got to figure out how to continue to be that magnet for talent. And if you make it hard to come and harder to stay, I'm sure you're tracking this with Georgia Tech, but most of the students from other countries are down, and more are leaving when they graduate, in many cases because they aren't allowed to stay. Well, that's kind of stupid. If we're able to somehow convince them to come here and give them this great education, which, by the way, we're subsidizing, and then we kick them out, so they have to go to some other country and start a company there that they want to start here that could have created jobs here. Well, that's just stupid. And so it's no more complicated than that in terms of the core issue of winning that battle for talent. It does get more complicated, obviously, because immigration is super complicated and super emotional, and there are all kinds of issues around legal immigration and border security. Everything gets wrapped up together. But at the core, if we do not change our policies around immigration to continue to be a magnet for talent, we will lose our way, we will lose our lead, and America will cease to be the most innovative entrepreneurial nation in the world. And we'll look back and say, well, that was stupid. It's happening right now. We've lost ground in the last decade, and we need to make sure we reverse that. So yes, we need to focus on our own community. Yes, we need to make sure we're doing a better job with the education system, so the people growing up in our communities have those opportunities. But we still, even if we're doing an awesome job on that, we still need to, be a magnet for people in other places, because that's going to ensure that we, or at least maximize the likelihood that we can win this next battle and continue to maintain our lead.
Wow. Well, Steve, I can't thank you enough for not just joining us, and for all you're doing nationwide to be that voice of entrepreneurship, to be that source of inspiration for people across the country, but also for helping us frame the conversations for the rest of the day, which I know are going to make a difference in shaping our path forward in this journey. So please join me in expressing our appreciations to Steve.
Thank you all.
Thank you, my friend.